My name is Evans. I'm 28 years old, and today I live a life I once thought was only possible in daydreams. A small but bright apartment overlooking the city skyline, a job that challenges me, and most importantly, a sense of peace that no one can take away. But getting here wasn't the triumphant, joyful journey I once imagined. It was quiet, lonely at times. And it started with a suitcase resting by the front door of my childhood home, packed not for a grand adventure, but because I wasn't welcome there anymore. I had just turned 18 when it happened. The morning after I found out I'd won a full scholarship to a university hours away, I stood in our kitchen, heart pounding with excitement. I still remember clutching the acceptance letter so tightly that the edges wrinkled in my hands. I thought it would be a moment of celebration. That maybe, just maybe, my dad would finally look at me and see someone he was proud of. Instead, he barely glanced up from his coffee. He said it so casually, almost as if it were a minor inconvenience he had forgotten to mention. "If you're leaving for that scholarship, don't bother coming back." No anger, no shouting, just a flat decree, like the closing of a door I hadn't even realized I was standing in front of. I didn't argue. I didn't cry, not until later, alone in the driveway. I simply packed what I could fit into one old suitcase and walked out the door, my sneakers crunching quietly over the gravel as I left behind everything I thought I knew about family. Standing there, one foot still on the porch, I remember thinking, this is it. This is the moment my life starts, and the moment my old life ends. Growing up, my world always seemed to revolve around my father's moods. His name carried weight in our small town. Evans & Sons Hardware had been around for decades, and Dad wore that legacy like armor. He believed in hard work, obedience, and loyalty. At least, that's what he preached. What he actually demanded was control. In our house, love was a currency you earned, and the exchange rate was steep. My siblings learned early how to navigate it. My older brother, Tom, figured out that agreeing with everything Dad said was the surest path to approval. My younger sister, Maggie, perfected the art of staying invisible, quiet, pliable, never pushing too hard. But me? I wasn't good at pretending. I asked too many questions. I wanted things Dad didn't understand. Things you couldn't build with your hands or measure with a balance sheet. When I was 8 years old, I told him I wanted to be a writer. His face barely moved, except for the small twitch at the corner of his mouth, the one he always got when he was annoyed. "Writers don't put food on the table," he said, already turning back to the evening news. It was a pattern that played out again and again over the years. An art project I was proud of? Barely a grunt of acknowledgement. Winning the school spelling bee? A shrug? Earning top grades? That's expected, he'd say, already moving on. But when Tom scored a few points in a junior varsity basketball game or Maggie volunteered to help in the store, Dad would beam with pride, bragging to anyone who would listen. It wasn't just about interests or hobbies. It was about obedience, about fitting into the version of life Dad believed in, simple, predictable, under his thumb. Money was another tool he used to keep us tethered. Every dollar flowed through him, like a gatekeeper deciding who deserved what. Tom got a used car the day he turned 16, even though he barely scraped by in school. Maggie was quietly handed cash whenever she needed something small. But when I hinted about a school trip or a debate club fee, the answer was always the same. If you want it so bad, earn it yourself. At the time, I didn't resent the hard work. In some strange way, I even respected it. I believed, really, believed, that if I just worked hard enough, if I achieved enough, eventually I would unlock some hidden door in my father's heart, that he would finally see me, choose me, be proud of me. That belief became the undercurrent of my life. I stayed late after school for extra tutoring sessions. I worked part-time at the library. I studied until my eyes burned. Every achievement, every small victory, I tucked away like currency, saving for the day I could finally cash it in for love. The scholarship felt like my golden ticket. It wasn't just about escaping a small town or getting a degree. It was proof, tangible, undeniable proof, that I was worth something. When the acceptance letter came in, I remember clutching it against my chest and closing my eyes. For the first time in my life, I felt like I had won something that no one could take away. I allowed myself to imagine Dad smiling, maybe even hugging me. I pictured the family gathering in the living room, maybe even clinking glasses in celebration. I thought about him bragging to his friends at the hardware store, telling them how proud he was of his daughter, the one going off to college on a full ride. I didn't realize until much later that I had built that dream alone, brick by brick, without a foundation. And it was always going to crumble the second I tried to lean on it. The truth was, Dad never wanted me to leave. Not because he would miss me, but because control only works when you're within arm's reach. If I left, I wasn't just breaking away from the family. I was rejecting his entire blueprint for how life was supposed to be lived. In his mind, ambition wasn't a virtue. It was a rebellion. That scholarship wasn't just a piece of paper. It was a declaration of independence. And to him, that was unforgivable. The day of the scholarship announcement still feels strangely vivid to me, like a movie reel I can rewind frame by frame. It happened on a Thursday morning during a school assembly in the crowded, buzzing gymnasium. Rows of plastic chairs squeaked under restless students, and the microphone crackled as the principal tapped it twice before speaking. When he called my name, it took a second for the words to sink in. Full academic scholarship, full ride, room, board, tuition, everything. I heard the scattered claps around me, the murmurs of congratulations, the pride in my guidance counselor's smile. And for a moment, everything else disappeared. It felt like standing in the sun after years of shadow. Afterward, a few teachers shook my hand. Friends hugged me. Someone even joked that I'd be famous someday. I soaked it all in like someone breathing deeply after holding their breath too long. All I could think about was telling my dad, about finally seeing him proud. The drive home was a blur. Familiar streets whipping past the window as my heart raced faster than the car. I practiced the words in my head. How I'd tell him. How maybe, for once, he would pull me into one of those big, rare hugs he used to give Tom after basketball games. When I pulled into the driveway, I noticed the garage door was halfway open, the way Dad always left it when he was in the workshop. The smell of sawdust hit me as I stepped inside, letter clutched in my hand. He was bent over the workbench, tightening bolts onto something I couldn't quite see. I waited until he finished, my throat dry, palms sweating. "Dad?" I started, voice steadier than I felt. "I have some news." He didn't look up. "Make it quick," he muttered, reaching for another wrench. I took a breath and stepped closer, holding the letter out like an offering. "I got it, the full scholarship to State University. Room, board, everything covered. I'm going to college, Dad." The moment stretched, long enough that I thought maybe he hadn't heard me. Then he straightened, wiped his hands on a rag, and turned to me. There was no pride in his eyes, no smile, no, "I'm proud of you, kid." Instead, he gave a short, humorless laugh. "So you think you're better than us now?" The words hit harder than any slap could have. "No, I started, but he waved me off. "You think you're too good for the family business, too good for real work." His voice was low, almost casual, but each word landed like a hammer. I opened my mouth to explain, to say that this was everything I had worked for, that it didn't mean I loved them any less. But I knew it didn't matter. He had already decided what my ambition meant to him. A betrayal. A rejection. He tossed the rag onto the workbench with a finality that made my chest tighten. "If you walk out that door," he said, voice flat and final, "don't bother coming back. You're on your own now." The world didn't spin. My knees didn't buckle. It wasn't dramatic like that. It was worse, because everything stayed perfectly, chillingly still. The only sound was the slow drip of something leaking onto the concrete floor. I nodded. Not because I agreed, but because I understood. There was no fight to be had. No words that could fix what was already broken. I turned without another word. The letter still crumpled in my hand. Packing didn't take long. I had spent most of my life keeping things small, contained, knowing not to take up too much space. A suitcase, a backpack, a few worn books. That was it. Tom and Maggie weren't. Maybe that was a blessing. Maybe it would have been worse, trying to explain something even I didn't fully understand yet. I hesitated at the front door, one hand on the knob. The house was so familiar. The creaky stair near the landing, the chipped corner of the dining table, the scratch on the hallway wall where I had once crashed my bike into it as a kid. It should have felt harder to leave. Instead, there was only a quiet certainty settling into my bones. A realization that this house had never really been home. Not in the way I needed. I set my suitcase down on the porch for a second and looked back. No one was there. No footsteps rushing after me. No voices calling me back. I wasn't walking away from anything. I was simply stepping into the truth. The engine of my car sputtered to life. I glanced once more at the house, at the sagging gutter and the battered mailbox with our family name barely visible through years of rust. And then I drove away. There was no music. No triumphant soundtrack. Just the rhythmic thump of the tires over the uneven road and the steady beat of my own heart in my ears. For the first few miles, I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see someone waving me back. But the road behind me stayed empty. In that silence, I finally understood. My father's love had never been unconditional. It had always been transactional, offered only when I fit neatly into his vision of who I should be. And the second I stepped outside that box, it was revoked without hesitation. There was grief in that realization, but also, strangely, a kind of freedom. I hadn't lost a father that day. I had simply stopped pretending I ever really had one. Looking back, the signs had always been there. When I was 9 years old, I won first place in the regional science fair. It wasn't a grand event, just a bunch of folding tables lined up in the school gym, covered in poster boards and hastily glued models. Still, for me, it was everything. I had spent weeks perfecting my project, a model of renewable energy, sources made from scraps I'd scavenged around town. I remember standing next to it, hands shaking slightly as the judges asked me questions, praying I wouldn't stumble over my words. When they announced my name, I thought my heart might actually burst. A blue ribbon, a small trophy. Nothing fancy, but to me it was proof that my hard work meant something, that I could make something out of almost nothing. I ran all the way home, the trophy clutched tightly in both hands. Dad was in the garage, fixing the lawnmower. I stood in the doorway, beaming, waiting for him to notice. "Dad, look," I said, holding up the trophy like it was the Holy Grail. "I won first place." He barely glanced up. "A science fair?" he said, wiping grease from his hands. "That and $2 buy you a cup of coffee." Then he turned back to the mower without another word. I stood there for a long time, the metal of the trophy suddenly feeling cold and heavy in my hands. After a while, I quietly set it down on the workbench and walked away. It wasn't an isolated moment. It was a pattern. Whenever I achieved something that didn't fit into his narrow definition of success, whether it was art, writing, or academics, it was dismissed, minimized, sometimes even mocked. When I said I wanted to join the debate team in middle school, He laughed and asked if I was planning to become a politician. When I earned straight A's in high school, he told me grades didn't matter if you couldn't pound a nail straight. Any independence, any dream that didn't orbit around him, was treated like a threat. And slowly, without realizing it, I internalized the lesson he was so determined to teach, that no matter how hard I worked, it would never be enough. Unless I conformed. Unless I stayed small and grateful and unthreatening. But I didn't want small things. I wanted more. Not out of greed, but out of a deep, aching need to build a life that felt like my own. I kept trying, though. Over and over again, I set up new milestones in my mind. Maybe if I get accepted into honors English, he'll notice. Maybe if I win the state writing competition, he'll say he's proud. Each time, the goalposts moved. Each time, the silence grew heavier. The night after he kicked me out, I sat alone in the parking lot of a cheap motel, staring at my reflection in the rearview mirror. And for the first time, I saw the pattern with brutal clarity. The scholarship wasn't a breaking point, it wasn't an anomaly. It was the inevitable conclusion of a lifetime spent chasing approval that was never going to come. It wasn't about the science fair trophy. It wasn't about the grades, or the college acceptance, or the scholarship. It was about control. It had always been about control. The second I chose my own path, the second I dared to succeed on my terms instead of his, I became disposable. That realization didn't bring instant peace. It hurt, more than I had words for. But it also cracked, something open inside me. A space where, for the first time, I could start building something real. Not a life constructed out of desperate attempts to be good enough, but a life built from the simple, quiet truth that I already was, and that I always had been. College wasn't easy. Without a safety net from home, every semester was a battlefield of odd jobs, scholarship paperwork, and scraping by. I worked the early shift at a coffee shop 2 days a week, interned unpaid on weekends, and studied in the corners of crowded libraries until they kicked me out at closing. There were nights when the exhaustion hit so hard, it felt like gravity had doubled. But even in the hardest moments, there was something strangely liberating about it all. Every bill I paid, every meal I cooked for myself, every long night I survived, it built something inside me. A quiet, stubborn pride. By the time I graduated, I wasn't the same girl who had stood in the garage holding a crumpled letter. I had built a life from scratch, one where my worth didn't depend on anyone's permission to exist. Meanwhile, back home, the cracks in Dad's empire were starting to show. At first, it was small things, the hardware store running strange discount sales, hours being cut back, murmurs around town about unpaid invoices. I heard about it secondhand through Maggie, who would call sometimes under the pretense of just checking in. Dad had always been good at running the shop the old-fashioned way. Face-to-face deals, handshakes, loyalty built over coffee cups. But the world had changed, and he hadn't changed with it. Online suppliers, big box competition, and newer regulations, they came fast and hard. Dad's refusal to adapt turned stubbornness into a slow, steady bleed. I stayed away, not out of spite, but because I knew what would happen if I went back. He would expect me to fix it, to slot myself back into his orbit like nothing had happened. To sacrifice my hard-earned independence just to save a business that had never once been built for me. And I had promised myself, quietly, firmly, that I wouldn't trade my soul for a seat at a table where I was never really welcome. The first call came about 6 months after I started my first full-time job. An unfamiliar number. Dad's voice, gruff and tight. "Things are rough at the store," he said without greeting. "I could use another set of hands. Someone who knows the books." He didn't apologize, didn't even acknowledge the years between us. Just a simple expectation that I would drop everything and come running. I listened carefully. not because I was considering it, but because I needed to hear it, to be sure that the dynamic hadn't changed, that he still saw me as an extension of his will, not as a person with a life of her own. When he finished explaining, carefully avoiding any words like help or sorry, there was a long pause. "I'm sorry," I said finally, voice calm. "I can't do that." Another silence, heavier this time. "So that's it?" he said, voice hardening. "You think you're too good for us now?" A familiar refrain, the same song, different verse. "No, Dad," I said quietly. "I just have my own life now." He hung up without another word. I sat there for a long time after, staring at the screen, feeling the strange mixture of sorrow and relief settle in my chest. The guilt came, as I knew it would. Waves of it. Years of training don't disappear overnight. Tom sent a few curt texts. Maggie called and cried, begging me to reconsider. Even distant cousins chimed in with vague, shaming Facebook messages about family loyalty. But I stayed firm. Because I knew, deep down, that the moment I went back, I would lose everything I had fought for. The store struggled on for a few more years, limping from one bad quarter to the next. Dad refused to modernize, refused to listen to anyone's advice. He sank more and more money into outdated inventory, refused offers to partner with local contractors, and resisted every attempt to innovate. Pride, it turned out, was an expensive habit. Eventually, the business folded quietly. No dramatic foreclosure, no public spectacle. Just a "for sale" sign appeared in the window one chilly morning, and a building shuttered a few months later. I found out through a news blurb online. No one called to tell me directly. I stared at the article for a long time, tracing the black and white photo of the old storefront with my finger. There was no joy in it. No triumph. Just a heavy, bittersweet ache for what could have been. If only love had mattered more than control. If only I had been seen instead of measured. If only my success hadn't felt like a betrayal to him. Sometimes I wondered what he thought in the end. If he blamed me for walking away. If he ever realized that I wasn't the one who chose distance, that he had made that choice long before I ever packed my suitcase. But I didn't chase those questions down. I let them drift, like leaves on a slow river, because the real justice wasn't in his business failing. It wasn't in the silence or the missed calls. It was in the life I had built. A life where I didn't have to apologize for existing, for dreaming, for wanting more. A life where I was enough, simply because I chose to be. And that, I realized, was the quietest, deepest kind of freedom there was. Life after cutting ties wasn't a sudden transformation. It didn't feel like stepping into the light after a storm. It was quieter than that, like slowly realizing you can breathe easier when the weight pressing on your chest is gone. I built my life piece by piece, steady and careful. I found a job that didn't just pay the bills, but made me feel useful, respected. I saved for a tiny apartment with sun-washed windows and a creaky old floor that sang under my steps. I surrounded myself with people who didn't measure my worth by how convenient I was for them. Friends who celebrated my wins without competition. Mentors who saw potential instead of problems. For the first time, I lived without the constant ache of trying to prove myself to someone who had already made up their mind about me. I found peace in small things. A cup of coffee on my balcony at sunrise. An evening run where the city lights blurred into soft rivers of gold, late night. Phone calls filled with laughter instead of judgment. Didn't realize how much space guilt had occupied in my life until it was finally gone. Years passed. I heard bits and pieces about my family through Maggie, who still called sometimes. Dad eventually retired, sold what little was left of the store. He stayed in town, nursing old grievances like they were prized possessions. I didn't hate him. Not anymore. Hate takes energy, and I had better things to spend my energy on. One crisp fall afternoon, years after I had left, I found myself driving through my old neighborhood. It wasn't planned. I had taken a wrong turn after a work meeting and realized I was only a few streets away from the house I grew up in. Curiosity nudged me. The house looked smaller than I remembered. The white paint was peeling, and the once manicured lawn was patchy and overgrown. I pulled over and sat in my car for a long time, just looking at it. Memories flickered across my mind, good ones and painful ones woven together so tightly they were impossible to separate. Learning to ride my bike on that cracked sidewalk. The night I got grounded for talking back, when I asked why my ideas were never good enough. Quiet Sunday mornings where hope still lived before disappointment moved in. I didn't cry. I didn't feel the tight knot of longing I once thought would always be there. Instead, there was a gentle, almost tender sadness, like visiting an old wound that had long since scarred over. I thought about getting out, walking up to the porch, and touching the doorknob one last time, but I didn't need to. Sitting there in the driver's seat, I realized I had already said goodbye a long time ago. Not in anger, not in spite, just in acceptance. Some relationships are too broken to fix. Some people love in ways that hurt more than they heal. And some dreams, like being chosen, being celebrated by people who can only see you through their own fear, are better left behind. It didn't make me bitter. It made me free. I started the engine, turned the wheel, and drove away without looking back. The road ahead wasn't smooth or perfect, but it was mine. I had built a life not from rebellion, not from revenge, but from a quiet, stubborn kind of hope. The belief that I deserved more than conditional love, that I was enough without having to earn it. And that, I realized as the city skyline came back into view, was the real victory. Not watching anyone fall. Not proving anything to the people who doubted me. But I stand tall in my own story. Loving myself enough to let go. Choosing peace over and over again. And finally, finding home. Not in a house or in someone else's approval, but in myself.